Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight, we're traveling to Japan, a land where mountains, forests, and seas are filled with spirits, gods, and stories that have shaped its culture for thousands of years. This is the entire story of Japanese mythology and folklore. Where did the gods come from? How was the world created? And how did myths of storms, sun, and shadow become part of everyday life? We'll begin with the creation of the islands, the birth of the gods Izanagi and Izanami, and the tale of the sun goddess Amaterasu. Then we'll wander through stories of trickster foxes, haunting spirits, and heroes who faced monsters with courage and grace. These are tales that mix beauty with mystery, history with imagination, stories that still echo through shrines, festivals, and quiet corners of Japan today. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. If you enjoy these stories, please take a moment to comment and subscribe. It is the easiest way to support this channel, and it means a lot. Thank you for being here. Now, let us begin. In the hush before time, there was only a slow breathing dark. It was neither empty nor full, neither cold nor warm, a stillness that held the promise of every motion yet to come. That quiet was not a void in the way a cave is hollow. It was a cradle of first memory, a place where the seeds of light and substance drifted like pollen in air that had not yet learned to stir. Out of that pregnant silence, the subtle began to separate from the dense. What was light rose into heights not yet named, and what was heavy sank toward a place that would one day feel the tread of feet. Between them, a misted expanse waited, a field of unworked possibility. From the rising came a precinct of the pure. It was called the High Plane of Heaven, a realm so refined that no shadow could cling to its edges. From the settling came a land that would later be known as the Central Reed Plain, raw and wet and restless, a world like a marsh that dreamed of becoming a country. Before there were oceans, before mountains found their spines, before trees learned the patience of rings, there were only tendencies, the first leanings of the world. It is in such tilting places that gods are born. The earliest gods appeared as thoughts given form by their own clarity. They did not descend from anyone. They stood up from the fabric of being and opened their eyes. They were makers without hands, minds that set law before there were courts of stars, and among them were presences whose names have the sound of beginnings. There was the Lord of the august center of heaven, a ruler in stillness. There were the divine generators whose very names feel like breath taken in and let out. Not one of them needed marriage or birth. They were of themselves and by themselves, and when their work in that first brightness was finished, they receded like a tide that leaves a shore shining. More deities rose in quiet batches, each a strand in a rope that would bind heaven to earth. They were not the ones who would give the world its islands and its weather. They were the ground on which such acts would be possible. As the generations of the early gods unfolded, the creative task passed down the invisible chain until it reached a pair meant for the heavy labor of shaping. Their names have the strength of ceremony. He who invites. She who invites, Izanagi and Izanami. They were not a couple in the way mortals are joined by the long plait of shared days. They were a pair chosen by a council of deities who understood that the world beneath had congealed into a beautiful incompletion. The high plane needed builders with patience and daring, and the central reed plane needed parents. There is a bridge that is not a beam and not a rope, a span that hangs between the world we can taste and the realm we imagine when we close our eyes. The gods called it the floating bridge of heaven. Upon this unanchored path, the inviting pair stood, their robes stirring in a wind that had not yet learned direction. Into Izanagi's hands they placed a spear that was also a symbol, a shaft decorated with jewels that did not glitter so much as glow. It was the heavenly jeweled spear, no ordinary tool, for its point knew how to find the heart of chaos. The world below them moved like the skin of a creature that dreams. It was sea and not sea, a softness under which the bones of land waited. The two leaned forward as a midwife leans toward the sound of a first cry. Together they lowered the spear and dipped its point into the churn. They did not stab. They stirred, gently at first, then with a rhythm that knits threads into cloth. The spear came up heavy with shining drops that fell back in slow pearls. Where each drop struck the surface of the unmade sea, a skin formed and thickened. It gathered itself, became a hummock, then a mass, and at last an island. The first solid under heaven. They named it Onagoro, which is to say self-coalesced, a place that chose to be a place. There are beginnings within beginnings. The new land needed a center, and the pair of creators stepped down from the floating bridge to the still damp soil. At the heart of Onagoro they raised a pillar so graceful and tall that it seemed a reed that grew forever upward. Around this pillar, which was both the axis of the world and the first architecture, Izanagi and Izanami performed a rite. They circled it in opposite directions, as if to weave a knot in the air. As they passed each other, they spoke greetings, and in that moment the first words rang upon Earth's ear. Their first attempt at union produced a child that was not right, a poor creature without the bones to stand. The island that lived within that first child was unfit for dwelling and was set adrift upon the surface of the waters. They brought their sorrow to the gods who had commissioned them, and in that council the error was understood. Form has etiquette. Words must be said in a right order. If one speaks first whose turn it is not, harmony is bruised. They returned to the pillar, circled again, spoke in the proper turn, and in that precise ceremony found the answer that opens every locked gate. When they came together after the corrected rite, the land responded. The great 8 islands were born. They did not spring all at once like sparks from a struck stone. They came as a family comes, one after another, each with its own face. Awaji rose first, a long and gentle creature that stretched itself between other lands not yet risen. Shikoku followed, faceted and calm. Oki and Kyushu and Iki, Tsushima and Sado, and finally Honshu, the great backbone of the archipelago, rolled its shoulders from the sea. The people who would one day travel these shores were still the dream of clay, but their roads were being drawn. Rivers learned their beds. The winds remembered routes. The coastlines traced elegant parentheses around future lives. Izanagi and Izanami did not stop at islands. They set about filling the world with its textures. They brought forth the gods who would dwell in tide and current, who would rule fog and rain, who would take the seat of mountains and the nest of valleys. There were deities of marsh and fern, of the bark that protects the tree and the sap that climbs its veins. They delivered gods of bast fiber and weaving, of rice and of the dikes that keep rice fields tame. They breathed out the guardians of roofs and hearths, of thresholds and roads. The catalogue of spirits grew long and beautiful. It was as if the pair were painting with living colors, each stroke a god with tasks and stories of its own. In their palace upon Onagoro, which now stood not as a lone island, but as the first of many, there was joy and purpose. Creation is a high intoxication that leaves the maker radiant and spent. They rested between labors and planned the next children of earth. The sea was salted and given tides. Rivers were taught to braid through plains. The first forests lifted their layered canopies, and the first cranes rehearsed the careful dance that would please the eyes of future enchantments. Night did not yet possess the full weight of its velvet. Day did not yet carry the glory of its crown. Those glories were waiting in their turn. In time, Izanami felt the fierce heat of another birth rising within her. This birth would not be like the others. There are gifts that come wrapped in danger. There are boons that ask a cost. She labored, and the world held its breath, and in the instant when the child slid free, a blaze ran through her, as if the sun had chosen to be born through a mortal door. The child was the spirit of fire made flesh. His name was Kagutsuchi. Flame is both banquet and plague. It means hearth and it means ash. The first breath of the fire child scorched the mother who gave it. Izanami lay pale and still, her robes shriveled at the edges, her lips cracked by the kiss of the heat she had delivered. The palace that had rang with delight fell silent. Izanagi gathered the child whose presence still crackled in the air, and he trembled with torn love and sudden fury. There is a grief that makes a god act like a man. In a passion that was half justice and half the helpless rage of a husband who cannot call his wife back from the far shore, Izanagi drew his blade. He struck. The bright boy of fire died beneath his father's stroke, and out of the blood that spilled from the wound leaped new and terrible powers. Godhead is fertile even in death. From the sprayed crimson came mountains and rivers and gods who had the strength of molten stone. Where pieces of the severed body fell upon the earth, new spirits rose who would one day be called upon to shape mines and forge plows and swords. If sorrow has any mercy, it is that it is not barren. The world multiplies even as it mourns. Izanagi went to his wife and knelt beside her. She was not cold. She was slipping, as if pulled by a soft current whose direction he could not know. The attendants had laid her hair in order and covered her with garments that tried to deny the truth that had alighted like a black bird upon the beam of that house. Izanagi spoke to her with the quiet voice that gods use when they are afraid. He told her the sea needed her. He told her the mountains were asking for her counsel. He told her that he had done a terrible thing, but that he would pull down the stars one by one if that would keep her. She was already listening to a sound he could not hear. The land of the dead was not yet a place of punishments and scales. It was a realm of return and rest, a shadowed mirror of the world above. Izanami drifted toward it as if walking down a long beach at dusk. The water she entered was not wet. The light that greeted her was neither dawn nor darkness, but a perpetual afterglow. She looked back only once, and even in that glance her eyes were already filmed by the lore of that country. There is a border that no hand can hold, not even the hand of a god who made islands with a spear. In the halls of Onogoro, a great silence pressed upon the carved pillars. The gods of wind muted their songs. The gods of river kept their music under stones. Izanagi felt the emptiness that follows the folding of a life. A wise grief knows that the world does not stop when one heart stops. The rice plants will still seek light. The sand will still take the shape of every footfall and forget them. But he was not wise. He was a husband, and he loved what had gone to a land that barred its gate to pleading. He resolved to break that barring. The high plain had chosen him for his resolve, and now he would stake it against the oldest gate of all. He would go down, He would find the entrance to the hidden kingdom, and he would bring her back. This thought was a flame that did not burn his hands. It lit his way along the spilling edge of seas, and through ravines where the air smelled of fern and rust. He descended through caverns that sighed with breaths not his own. He descended until the voice of the living world was only a hum behind him, and the voice of the underworld trembled in front of him, a voice that had the shape of a corridor lined with sealed doors. The entrance to Yomi was no door. It was the negative of a door, a place where a passage had decided not to finish. He stood at its lip and felt the cool of a wind that had never touched the Sunday he went in. At first there was a light like the light beneath eyelids. Then that faded, and he learned to walk by the memory of her hand. He called her name. It sounded like a bell struck in snow. There were answers in the distance, voices that might have been water and might have been sorrow talking to itself. He called again, and this time his voice touched something that turned toward him. She was there, not as he would have her, not as she had been beside him on Onogoro, bright as the skin of a fresh seed. But there, in that dusk, her shape moved, and his heart leaped into his throat, like a fish startled from shadow. He reached for her. She held away with a gentle firmness. She spoke softly, and her words did not ring the way words born in sunlit air ring. She told him that she had eaten of the food of this country. That act binds like an oath. The grains of that table had dissolved into her and made a covenant. She wanted to return, but the law of the far side of the rock is clear. She would plead for release with the lords of that realm. She begged him not to look upon her until she had secured their leave. "Promise," she said, and he promised. He was a god, but he was also a husband in a country of doubt. Promises made in the dim need the bright discipline of patience. Izanagi waited in a place where waiting does not flow like a river but stands like a wall. How long he waited, no measure remembers. Silence in such places thickens until it must be cut. At last fear bent his promise. He felt for the torch he had carried and hid. He coaxed a spark into flame and lifted it. Light took the room in its hands and showed him what it held. He saw his wife. He saw the bride of his memory wearing the terrible crown of the land that eats its guests. Her flesh had taken on the changes of this place. In her hair perched creatures of thunder with faces like clenched fists. In her mouth lived secrets that gnawed at their prison. From her skin hung heavy shadows like vines from an old tree. The sight broke him in a way that no blade can. He cried out. The sound woke the house. The wardens of that land stirred. She who had begged him not to look felt the betrayal as if it were a blade laid along her ribs. There are chases in the world above that end at a fence. In the world below, a chase ends at a stone. Izanagi ran, and the guardians of Yomi ran after him, and in their mouths were frogs, and in their hands were the implements of hunger. He fled by the little flame, and the little flame shook in the wind of their pursuit. He came to the place where the world's passage tightens. He pulled free a boulder that was not only a stone, but also a law, and he wedged it into the gap. The guardians beat upon it with the dull fury of ritual. On one side he panted, a god with ash on his fingers. On the other side she stood with the calm that anger brings when it wears sorrow as a mantle. She spoke to him then through the rock. Her voice had weight enough to bend iron. She told him that he had shamed her. She told him that because of this betrayal she would drag down 1,000 living souls every day. He pressed his palm to the stone and answered with a rage that was also resolve. Then I will cause 1,500 births each day, so life will outnumber death, and the living will have a slender advantage. Between those two sentences, the balance of the world was hammered into a blade that cuts us all. He left the stone where it was and climbed back through the veins of the earth. When he came into the light of the upper world, the sun laid itself across his shoulders like a shawl. He did not raise his face to it. He had brought up what the underworld always gives to those who walk it. The smell of endings, the dust of places where names fall away. He was unclean, and though a god's stain is not like that of a man, stain is stain. He walked to a clear river that knew how to forget the footprints of birds. At its edge, he took off the garments that had brushed the caverns. From those garments, as he set them aside, spirits rose. The band that held his hair unfurled, and a deity stepped from the smooth curve. His sandals came away, and tiny gods climbed from the pressed straw. In the high air, another power shook itself so that the very act of disrobing was like tossing a handful of seeds into a tilled field. He stepped into the river, and the water closed around his calves with the sigh of a friend returning. He cupped the water and moistened his lips, and the taste was the opposite of Yomi. It was not thick, it was not old. It was the first brightness poured into a bowl. He washed his left eye, and out of that ablution rose a resplendent goddess who seemed to carry daylight beneath her skin. He washed his right eye and cast it to the sky, and from that washing blazed a god whose silver calm spoke of the slow march of months. He blew the last of the underworld air from his nose, and out of that exhalation came a god who walked with storm at his heels and sea wind in his hair. 3 noble children stood upon the bank, as if they had always been waiting to be called by their true names. The sun smiled in the face of the first. The moon bowed in the poise of the second. The third looked toward the horizon and saw waves lifting like a herd of pale-backed beasts. That moment at the river is one of the great hinges of the world. With it, the upper air found its rulers. The goddess of the sun took her place in the high plain, and wherever she looked, green things remembered that growth is a command. The god of the moon learned the secrets of cool travel and marked the steps by which the sea breathes. The Stormbringer was given the charge of the restless waters and the winds that bruise them. Their father stood upon the stones and felt the last filth of Yomi fall from him like old leaves. He had lost a wife. He had brought balance and children from that loss. The world is a market that insists on exchanges. We hate it. We live by it. From that day, the making of the world entered a new order. Sun and moon learned their circuits. The islands that had felt the sadness of their first mother now tasted the milk of regular seasons. The cranes rehearsed their winter journeys. Rice practiced the logic of flood and drain. The gods of hill and river added a new line to their prayers, for they could feel in those 3 new presences the beginning of a polity. Until then, the earth had been a village of scattered households. Now heaven had birthed a court. A court means more than thrones. It means wars and reconciliations, exiles and returns, contests that end in laughter, and contests that end in blood. Onogoro watched, its pillar still rising toward the unhandled blue. Izanagi turned away from the waterside and began to walk. Somewhere under that same sky, on the wrong side of a great stone, his first beloved had become a queen in a kingdom that mortals learn to name by many names. He did not call out to her again. A promise broken once is not a rope to be tugged. Instead, he looked at the tracks of his children where they had first stood, and he understood that the story he had started would belong to them now. The light would go into the cave and come out again. The storm would make mistakes and also miracles. The moon would separate from the sun and teach lovers to miss each other. Everything that would come was already beginning to move. The gods would laugh and shout and break, and mend the world as only immortals can. Serpents would drink wine and fall to swords. Heroes would be tricked into wisdom. The land would be offered and yielded. A grandson would come down the heavenly stairway and plant his foot in the soil and call the fields into an order that would one day be written in lore and song. For now the river ran, and the god who had washed away the smell of the underworld shook his hair and felt clean. In that cleanliness there was grief. Purity does not erase the impression left by love. It does not flatten the bed where two lay or smooth the stone where a hand pressed. Izanagi carried the shape of his sorrow like a mark cut into wood. That mark would be read by those who came after. It would be retold. It would become the reason fathers stand with strong faces at the threshold, while mothers teach children that food taken from the wrong table is a chain. The first chapter in any world is a chapter of separations. Heaven separates from earth so that each may become good at being itself. River separates from sea so that taste may vary and migrations have meaning. Life separates from death and then must live with the knowledge that the separation is both true and thin. The stone at Yomi is a door and a wall at once. The spear that stirred the first island is a bridge and a boundary. The gods who know all this step carefully. The gods who forget it learn with bruises. The rest of us listen to their stories and try to glean a rule for our small lives. All of this was written into the grain of the world when the first island hardened under the falling drops from a jeweled spear. The palace at the center of Onogoro stands even now in the imagination of the faithful, its pillar rising like a phrase that never finishes. The names of the Great Eight Islands are still spoken as if each were a bead rubbed warm by years of use. The tale of the fire child is still told around hearths that sometimes forget how to be merciful. The story of the boulder set in a mouth of the earth is still recited under breath when goodbyes are said to those who will not return. From the riverbank where a father found 3 sudden lights upon the face of the water, the world leaned forward into its next telling. It leaned toward the siblings whose quarrels and reconciliations would weave a net strong enough to hold a nation. It leaned toward the dragon whose tails would be cut and toward the sword that would pass from hand to hand like a promise. It leaned toward fields that would glow with rice and shrines that would clean the air with cedar and silk. The first breath had been drawn. The second was coming. The book had been opened by a spear point, and a pillar held the page against the wind. Grief is a teacher with a dark lamp. When Izanami slipped behind the stone of endings, Izanagi learned what no creator wishes to learn, that even a god can be made small by the loss of a companion. The islands he had coaxed from ocean foam stood where he had left them, green and obedient. Yet the air of Onogoro tasted of ash. Servants hushed their footsteps. The pillar at the world's navel seemed taller and lonelier. In that stillness, Izanagi chose the impossible course. If love seated a queen in the land of shadows, love would cross the threshold and ask her back. He began with signs. In the sanctuaries of the high plain, the older gods cast lots and read omens that drifted down like pale leaves. The lot declared that the passage into the other realm lay where the earth's skin grew thin and cold. Izanagi wrapped himself in travel robes and took a staff that knew the story of every tree. He set out along the edge of the islands, where cliffs speak the clean language of stone. He crossed beaches of new sand that squeaked under his sandals and followed river mouths where gulls rehearsed their bright quarrels. No mortal song marked his way. He was a husband, and that was enough. The entrance to Yomi does not declare itself with a gate. It is discovered by a change in the breath of the world. The wind from the sea fell silent. The insects forgot their lines. The ground lost its warmth as if the sun had decided to visit another story. A cleft opened in a hillside furred with ancient moss, and beyond it a corridor sloped into a patient dark. Izanagi did not call. He knew that names have power, and he had already spent his own name in a broken promise once. He steadied his heart and went down. The first bend in that corridor tasted of iron. The second smelled like rain that never arrives. The third swallowed sound so completely that even thought seemed to wear soft shoes. He met no guardians at the threshold. That custom belongs to later ages. Yomi, in its first telling, accepts the bold and allows them to prove whether they are worthy of regret. Izanagi walked until the pressure of the earth above felt like a hand on his head. Then the passage opened, not into a hall of pomp, but into a country where color had forgotten its duties. There were plains lit by a light that drew from neither sun nor moon. There were hills that remembered winter but could not name it. He called for her then, and the name rose like a kite that had lost its string. A figure moved on that pale plain, and the world tilted back toward order. Izanami stood before him. She was veiled by the lore of the place she had entered, and her voice came to him as if from behind woven reeds. She told him she had tasted the food of Yomi. To eat in that country is to promise to stay. She begged him to wait while she asked the kings beneath to unbind her. He must not look on her until leave was granted. There were reasons that had no place in sunlight. He swore to obey. Patience is a high right, and he almost kept it. The stillness grew heavy as roof tiles, and then heavier still. He felt an old fear begin to crawl, small and stubborn, and he turned from the appointed place and found a space in the wall where a root had dug in. He coaxed a fire from a spark and fed it with the shavings of his staff. It flared. He raised it. The light showed him what love seldom wishes to know. Izanami, sovereign of the first nursery, stood as the mistress of endings. Her body had taken on the order of Yomi. The proud lines of her face were burdened by a rule that eats beauty and calls the eating sacred. Around her crouched 8 thunder spirits, small and cruel and quick, each nested in a ruined place of her flesh. Within her mouth, a darkness pulsed that was not breath. In her hair, the dead winds had found apartments. He cried out. A grief can be loud enough to wake a city. It can also be loud enough to wake a nation of shades. The cry ran across the plain and through the corridors, and the guardians of that country stirred. They are called the women of Yomi in old tales, but they are less women than the rags of famine given sinew. Their hair is dry grass. Their eyes are lentils boiled too long. They came trotting with the quick little steps of hunger. Izanami also cried out, not in pity but in wrath. A promise broken at the edge of the world is an insult that even love cannot smooth. She called for the wardens to seize him. Izanagi fled. At first he fled like a god, swift and sure, and then he fled like a man, with fear cracking his pace into pieces. The wardens gained. He reached into his sleeve and pulled free the black headdress that marked his rank, and he cast it behind him. It became a vineyard in a breath, heavy with glistening clusters. The wardens fell to feed, tearing fruit with a fury that is older than manners. He ran on. When the sound of their chewing dwindled, he pulled the comb from his hair and threw it down upon the path. It burst into bamboo thick and tender, shoots pushing up as if they had always been planted there. The wardens stopped again to gorge themselves, for even in the underworld, new shoots taste of spring. He ran on. Their hunger did not keep them long. They came after with red mouths, and he heard a sound like the rustle of a grave cloth dragged over gravel. He saw a tree that remembered the sky and clambered it. but the bark crumbled beneath his fingers. He leapt and rolled and rose, and would have faltered then, but a grove of low trees full of round, pale treasure stood ahead. He seized 3 of the fruits and hurled them with a prayer that named them for their sweetness. The fruits split on the ground, and the scent of them cut like a blade through the chasing pack. Even shades turn aside for peaches. The wardens shied from the perfume and recoiled with spitting curses. Izanagi ran through the gap they left and reached the place where the world narrows into a throat. There the passage rose toward a grey light. He climbed and came to a mouth in the earth wider than a city gate. On this side the air held a memory of birds. On the further side a pressure built as if an army were climbing his spine. He turned, lifted a stone that was also a decree, and set it in the cleft. The stone was so large that it seemed the earth had been waiting to hand it to him. He braced it and felt the push from below slacken and then stop. From the other side came a voice that tasted of iron filings. Izanami named him Faithless. She vowed to pull 1,000 from the living each day to sit at her tables. He answered with the stubborn mercy of a maker, promising that 1,500 would be born in answer. Between those 2 sentences, the daily arithmetic of the world found its measure. He stood with palms on the stone and knew that the first part of the story had closed its door. There would be no return for her. There would be no reconciliation of hearth and grave. What there would be was balance. The stone has a name in legend. Some call it the Rock of Evenings. Some call it the weight against which tears break. Names of that sort are a kind of dressing for a wound. They keep the air off and let the skin knit. He did not go back to Onogoro. He had carried the smell of Yomi in his clothes and hair, and it clung like smoke. In the order of the gods, contact with death brings defilement. Purity is not whiteness. It is readiness. It is a state in which one can be spoken through by powers that mean well. Izanagi made for the river at Tachibana in the sun country of Himuka, a place where clean water runs over stones that remember nothing. He removed his sandals and set them aside, and the act released small spirits who had curled within the woven reeds. He loosened his girdle, and another spirit breathed itself into shape from the unknotted cord. He took off his robe, and from its folds rose deities with the personalities of fresh breezes. The story says that even his staff knew how to become God when it felt the ground again. He stepped into the river, and the water gave a little start, like a friend surprised by a guest returned. He washed his left arm, and a cluster of kami began to gather like birds on that bank, each a minor guardian with a task involving the edges of things. He washed his right arm, and the same happened. Then he cupped the river and poured it over his face. He began with the left eye. The water caught the sun and flung it back, and out of that brightness a goddess rose with a bearing that could instruct kings. Her radiance was not a glare. It was the active calm of noon. She stood with her hair bound by the horizon and lifted her gaze. The water ran to her feet and seemed content to have ended there. She spoke her name and the rocks listened. She was Amaterasu, the one who shines in the plain of heaven. He washed his right eye, and this washing drew a different light. It was cool and deliberate, the kind of light that tells shepherds when to fold their tents. From that washing, a god rose with a face in which patience and distance married. This was Tsukuyomi, lord of measured nights, who would number the months for fishermen and teach the silver fish of the sky how to be a clock. He did not smile. His presence was gentleness braided with law. At last Izanagi closed one nostril and blew out the air of Yomi that still clung there. From that proud gesture sprang a god whose stride had the length of weather. He smelled of salt and the steel taste of rain. He was Susanu, the restless, with hair like a storm front and a spirit that found kinship with every wave that slapped a rock and then slapped it again. He stamped once, and the river made a respectful bow. The three stood upon the pebbled shore, the sisters and the brother, not born of a bed but of a cleansing. That is the logic of their power. They are the children of refusal to be stained. The river widened. The birds returned to their appointed noise. Izanagi looked on the trio with a satisfaction that did not erase sorrow but made it carryable. He had lost one and gained three, and the arithmetic was not cruel. He named their realms with the firm voice of a sovereign who has built fields and knows how to assign them. Amaterasu would ascend to Takamagahara and rule the expanse where clouds learn their shapes. Tsukuyomi would number the nights and tend the calm economies of tide and temper. Susanoo would take charge of seas and storms and all things that prove the mettle of ships and the humility of sailors. The Chronicles of Purification list many more kami born from that rite, a whole court of thresholds and turns. There was a goddess for the crossing of rivers and a god for the removal of impurities at the rim of a village. There were guardians of drains and guardians of gutters, powers that bless the humblest of boundaries. This theology of edges is one of the deep colors of the old faith. The sacred is discovered not only in height, but in the careful tending of seams. When a road leaves a forest, there is a god that watches that step. When a child passes from fever to health, there is a god that registers the change with a nod. Izanagi stood in the flood of such presences and knew the world had been cleaned and reset. He did not forget Yomi. He did not curse it either. In the everyday speech of the shrines, death is not evil. It is heavy. It stains. It requires washings and recitations, and then life may resume. Izanagi left the river and shook his hair and felt the last weight slide away like a shawl. He ordered a shrine to be raised for the peach that had turned back his pursuers, a token of gratitude for sweetness that saves. He ordered rites for the spirits that rise from clothing and tools, which teach even immortals to treat possessions with respect. Then he turned his attention to the future, which now wore the faces of three young gods. Amaterasu went up. Stories say she took with her the mirror in which the world learns to recognize itself, and they say that when she sits, it is on a seat of white that does not forget any vow. She brought light that is not only brightness, but a discipline of warmth. Under her gaze, rice remembers to be generous, and the cranes find the patience to stand in snow-like lines in a poem. In time, her court would grow elaborate, and her quarrels would summon comedy and crisis in equal measure, but in this first moment, she was only purpose. Tsukuyomi moved in another way. He does not climb in a blaze. He steps. He is the arithmetic of the sea surface and the poet of frost. In his company, fishermen learn which nights speak kindly and which do not. Lovers learn when to believe in messages carved in silver, and farmers learn to sing the names of months as if they were family. He is a quieter glory than his sister, and quiet glories tend to last. Susanoo lingered by the shore, restless in victory. There are spirits born from cleansing who immediately seek a new stain to scour. He looked toward horizons and saw shapes that needed wrestling. His temper set the first hammering of distant thunder to a rhythm that warbands would remember. He was not wicked. He was a wind in need of harness and a wave in need of a coastline. The harness and the coastline would come. Izanagi, who had started the world with a spear and set its balances with a stone, walked away from Tachibana with the newly gathered powers at his back. He did not return to the pillar at Onogoro. The page had turned. In a mythic age, turning a page is a work to which rivers and mountains must agree. They agreed. The council of the first gods nodded like old trees. The staff that had seen caverns and sorrow allowed itself to be a stick again. From this day, the shape of the sky had meaning. The sun ruled as a person rather than a lamp. The moon counted as a mind rather than a coin. The sea learned its griefs and its gifts from a god who matched it breath for breath. The daily rites of purification were fixed in memory, so that every household could echo the river of Tachibana and keep the world ready to receive blessing. The terrible arithmetic declared at the border stone took hold. Each day the houses of ending opened their doors for 1,000. Each day 1,500 doors swung wide in the houses of beginning. Numbers do not console the bereaved, but they do feed the fields. A people can live by that surplus. Priests would later stand at river bends and chant the names of the many who had risen from that first washing. They would sweep the thresholds of shrines with brooms that know old songs. Women would tie cords to branches and ask that the stains of their households be taken downstream to unremembered places. Men would touch their foreheads to stones that look the way law feels. Children would learn to bow to mirrors and to their own reflections. All these customs are the ripples of one act. A husband went to fetch his wife from the land that never returns its guests. He failed. He set a stone where a door should be. He washed. 3 presences rose that would bind the next chapters together. So the stage is set for the quarrels and reconciliations of light, for the long conversations between day and night, and for the dangerous kindness of storms. The spear has done its work. The stone has done its work. The river has done its work. The rest belongs to the 3 who stood shining and wet on the bank while their father shook the last drops from his hair and told them where to sit. In the beginning of their rule, the 3 noble children did not yet know how sharp family love can become. The orders were clear. Amaterasu held the high plane and wore the work of day upon her brow. Tsukuyomi kept the silver account of the night. Susanoo strode along the borders of sea and weather. That clarity was a map. Yet maps do not still the wildness of hearts. The sun had the serenity of rightful place. The moon had the patience of numbers. The storm had the ache of an unfinished grief, for Susanoo carried a wound named for his dead mother, and it tugged at his temper as the tide tugs at a boat. Tsukuyomi was first to lose balance. Amaterasu appointed him to attend a banquet given by the goddess of food, who is called Ukemochi in the old songs. She desired to honor the court of heaven and the realm below with a feast that drew its flavors from every quarter. She turned to the sea and breathed out fish already seasoned with waves. She faced the mountains and released game dressed in herbs of the upper slopes. She looked upon the rice fields and filled bowls with grains steamed in their own perfume. The making of food is a sacred art, and in these early days it was raw miracle. Tsukuyomi watched the goddess work and felt disgust instead of reverence, for he saw that the gifts came from places that would later be veiled by kitchens. He condemned her as defiled and, seized by a proud revulsion, he slew the very host who had set the table. So ends one of the worst dinners in myth. Amaterasu heard of this act, and grief sharpened into judgment. She named the deed shameful and forbade Tsukuyomi ever to stand before her again. From that decree comes the custom that the sun and the moon do not visit the same sky. Day and night part company like estranged kin who exchange messages by the turning of seasons. In some tellings, the food goddess does not remain dead, for from the places where her body fell there rose the blessings of field and silk and millet and oxen and horses. If so, it would be another instance of the way the old stories weave sorrow into harvest. But the stain upon Tsukuyomi's name endured. He withdrew to the realm that his office determined and became a lord of measured distance. All this while Susanoo stormed. He wept and raged for the mother who had gone down among the dead. He churned seas and snapped trees by the root, and made even the brave gods of the high plain put stones in their sleeves and watch the sky. At last, their father Izanagi, who had set the balance of births against deaths and washed the underworld from his skin, told Susanoo to leave heaven. The order fell from a mouth that did not issue idle commands. Susanoo was to depart and take up his role in the lands below. Before he went, he swore that he would bid farewell to his sister and prove his intentions were not poisoned. Amaterasu is a sovereign who counts the cost of error. When word came that her unruly brother climbed toward the high plain, she girded herself for trouble. She braided her hair with authority and armed herself with the jewels of office. She arranged the court and met him with vigilance that looked like grace. Susanoo declared he had no wish to unseat her or overturn the halls. She did not trust him. He asked for a trial that would show the truth of his heart. "Let us each draw children from the regalia of the other," he said, "and let the nature of those children be witness to the purity of our intent." It was a peculiar contest. Amaterasu took the sword of Susanoo and with ritual precision broke it into pieces and washed these shards with words. From the breath that rose over that washing emerged 3 goddesses whose dignity shone like the line that separates day from night. Susanoo in turn took the string of Magatama jewels that hung upon the breast of Amaterasu and crushed them to mist with his teeth and spit. From that mist rose 5 male gods with proud brows and the wildness of first sons. Susanoo claimed victory not once but twice. First, he declared that the 5 boys belonged to him and that their strength proved his sincerity. Then Amaterasu argued that because the boys came from her jewels, they were hers, and that the 3 maidens had been born from his sword, and so were his. When she made this accounting, he again shouted triumph, since the 3 maidens were each worth a kingdom, and they issued from his property. In truth, neither claim mattered to what happened next, for the contest had stoked the heat in his blood, and victory made it boil. He ran through her fields and broke the banks that kept the water patient. He tore up furrows with the joy of a boy gone too far. He fouled the clean halls where fine cloth is stretched and beaten into a sheen, as if he could not bear the thought of order kept by rhythm. Last of all, and worst of all, he brought a pony of heaven, flayed it and hurled the carcass through the roof of the place where the women of the sun goddess were weaving. The sacred craft was broken, and a maiden died with her shuttle still in her hand. The act was desecration. It was a wound to heaven's household and a blow to the art by which garments are made for kings and for gods. Even those who loved the storm god looked away. There is a moment when a queen refuses to be struck again. Amaterasu left the court. She slipped away from the outrage and walked to a mountain gorge where a cave opened like a mouth. She entered that hollow and pulled a stone door against the world and sat within its black throat. She did not sulk. She removed herself from a creation that had forgotten how to deserve light. The withdrawal of a sun is not a metaphor in the language of gods. Day ended, crops bent and failed, wolves took courage. Things that hide by nature learned a new boldness and came to stare at the very doors of houses. The heavens lost their lamp, and despair settled like a second night. The gatherings of gods that followed are among the most beloved councils in any mythology. They came from distant corners, powers who usually keep to their own provinces, and crowded the riverbanks below the mouth of the cave. There were smiths whose anvils do not cool. There were jewelers whose hands hum when they touch stone. There were singers and dancers whose feet remember the world before it was a world. The gravity of disaster gave them a communal wit. They talked until their breaths made a small wind and decided that laughter might do what anger had failed to do. The plan required 3 gifts and a bravura performance. First, they asked the master smiths to forge a mirror broader than the bellies of drums, a disc so polished that it could hold a sky without a ripple. Ishikoridome is the name sometimes given to the deity of stone shaping, and by that hand, the mirror was made. Second, they asked the jewel maker, who is called Tamanuya in old recitations, to string together a length of curved jewels, as green as wet pine and as red as sake on fire. These would be hung to delight the eye of a goddess who has never been impervious to the kindness of beauty. Third, they gathered cocks with their proud combs and set them to crow without ceasing, so that the sound of morning would be present at the mouth of the night. Then they cleared a space and turned over a tub to make a stage, and onto it climbed Aim no Uzume, goddess of dawn and dance and unashamed laughter. She was small and strong and had a voice that could ring against a mountain. She stamped upon the tub until the wood barked like a seal. She told jokes with the frankness of a festival. She loosened her clothes in hints and wheeled her hips with the language that remembers where life begins. The other gods whooped and clapped and called out as if a bountiful harvest were being measured into baskets. The valley filled with a sound so bright that even grief sat up and listened. Inside the cave, Amaterasu felt the vibration of joy and frowned. She had left a world that had forgotten seriousness. Why then were they celebrating at the very door of night? She called out and asked what cause of delight could exist while the fields withered and the courts sat in darkness. Outside, Aim no Uzume declared that they had found a goddess more splendid than the sun, a new light whose face shone with a freshness that mocked all other day. Pride and curiosity touched a place in Amaterasu that no sorrow can permanently seal. She pushed the stone door a little way and peered out. They had hung the long string of jewels on a tree that had been dressed with white cloth and green leaves. They had placed the great mirror at an angle. When Amaterasu leaned toward the noise and the claims, she saw a radiant figure shining at the cave mouth. She did not know it was herself. Gods are as vulnerable as we are to the shock of their own reflection. She stepped closer, and the face in the mirror brightened and drew near. At that instant, a strong deity whose name is Aim no Tajikarao leaped forward, seized her wrist, and drew her out into the open. Others swung the stone door shut and dragged a heavy rope across it, a sacred rope knotted in such a way that even a goddess hesitates to cross. The light rolled over the valley like poured milk. The cocks rejoiced, and at last their crowing fit the world again. The relief ran through every rank of being. Rice lifted its young blades. The carp turned on their sides and showed gold. Even stones smiled in their slow way. The priests of later centuries would reenact the raucous dance of Uzume in solemn theaters and in village squares, for it is right to laugh at the memory of disaster overcome by wit. As for Susanoo, the court exacted penalties. His hair was cut, his nails were torn out. He was thrust from heaven at last and sent to the country of Izumo by a law that could no longer be negotiated. He went like a storm that has spent itself over mountains and heads for the lowlands in search of a new argument. It is worth pausing over the symbols gathered at the cave. The mirror would become one of the treasures by which a sovereign is recognized. It is the reminder that good rule is reflective rather than blind, that it requires a face to see itself and be corrected. The string of jewels remembers the first economics of worship and the sweetness by which the heart is steered toward attention. The rope pulled across the cave mouth is the ancestor of every sacred boundary drawn at shrines, the reminder that there are thresholds which should be crossed only in the right mind. The dance of Uzume endures wherever ceremony understands that the sacred is not only severe. Joy is a ritual as binding as grief. The quarrel of the siblings did not end with the opening of the cave. It found new chapters, new wounds, and new restorations. Yet this episode decided the great rhythm by which mortals live. Light can be lost and found. It can hide and be fetched with laughter and tact. The sun can be caught by a mirror and courted with jewels, and invited by songs that make even the sober shake their shoulders. In the oldest embers of the story, a community solved a divine crisis, not with spears or with scoldings, but with theater. That choice tells you what kind of people these gods made. Tsukuyomi took his place in the night sky and kept to his distance. He was not invited to the dance and would not have come if he had been. He learned to turn his face and hide it and return again, teaching human bodies when to harvest and when to wait, when to fish and when to sleep. He learned to loosen his hold on an insult and let the cold do the rest. The old insult remained, yet under his cool arithmetic, the world found a kinder pace. Amaterasu returned to the high plain with a companion the world had not known before. It was not a lover and not a guard. It was the knowledge that even the brightest must be invited. The mirror in her palace caught her eye on quiet afternoons and showed her a face not unlike the one at the cave mouth, except perhaps a little wiser. The court resumed its rituals. Cloth was woven again in the halls that had been made clean, and the songs of the loom sounded like rain in spring. Offerings were made to the goddess of food in her new forms, for from her slain body the gifts of agriculture had continued to arrive. The era of Tsukuyomi did not prevent the earth from being generous. Susanoo dropped toward Izumo, ignorant of the monster and the maiden who would soon alter his story and temper. His exile was not a defeat, so much as the turning of a page. The seas called him with the voices he had always heard in his skull and teeth. He brought with him an energy that is not evil but calls for contest and prudent limits. He would find those limits in a valley where a river runs like a wet sword, and in a house where an old couple weep for their last child. But that is the next part. For now, remember the cave and the laughter, and the moment when a goddess forgot her face and reached to touch it. Remember the smith who made a sun out of stone, and the jeweler who strung a river into a rope, and the dancers who pulled light back into the world with the earnest mischief of joy. Remember also the lesson tucked inside the scandal, that a court must have room for both dignity and play, or else the sun will grow tired and go sit alone in the dark. These are not morals. They are bearings by which a people steer. Exile does not quiet a wind. It redirects it. When the court of the high plain cut the nails of Susanoo and trimmed the fury from his hair and sent him down, the sea took possession of him at once. He fell toward the green provinces of the mortal world as a squall falls, with quick intent and the scent of salt in its cloak. The decree that banished him did not remove his nature. It gave the earth the chance to tutor it. The waves along the coast of Izumo received him with the booming welcome that stones give to breakers, and the god of storm and sea stepped ashore into a land of reeds, broad rivers, and mountain teeth. Izumo is a place where waters gather themselves and then hurry out to sea. The heavens loom close there, and mists are not shy. It suited him. He walked inland along a river that ran white at its edges and brown in its belly, and followed it until he heard human voices thick with sorrow. The sound came from a lean house pressed close to a bank that had seen floods. There an old man and an old woman were trying to persuade their hands not to shake. Between them sat a girl whose face wore the calm that belongs to those who have watched hope household by household and have learned not to call it by name. Susanoo asked for the cause of their tears. The old man looked up and saw a figure whose eyes held broken weather and sudden sunlight. He bowed until the floor found his forehead and said that his name was Ashinazuchi and that his wife was Tenazuchi and that their daughter was named Kushinada. Once they had 8 daughters. Each year a monster descended from the mountain range and took one, and that debt had been paid 7 times. The night would come when the beast would claim the last. There was no cliff from which to throw themselves that would be a sure defense. There was no shrine strong enough to hide a heartbeat. So they wept and waited for a door that had no hinges. Susanoo asked the name of the valley and learned it was in the land called Koshi, a name that breathes of older maps. He asked after their lineage and discovered that they traced their blood to the family of the food goddess that had once been wronged by the moon. Through such ties, destiny sets its snares and its rescues. He told the parents his name and declared that if they would give the girl to him as bride, he would cut calamity out of their story. The old man swore by every god who listens that he would bind the marriage with gratitude as well as law. The storm god nodded once, and at that nod the rafters remembered how to stand straight. Kushinada was the color of rice flowers when wind moves through them. Of such women, bards are careful to speak simply. Susanoo knew that a hero who lifts his sword over a monster must first place his beloved beyond that sword's wide swing. He touched her hair and changed her into a fine-toothed comb and set that comb into his own hair by his ear, so that her voice might whisper counsel and her nearness keep his heart steady. He stepped outside and looked upriver toward the mountain pass and felt the great animal presence turning its many heads toward the valley. The monster was called Yamata no Orochi. Old tellers say it had 8 heads and 8 tails, and a body so vast that it sprawled over 8 hills and 8 valleys, as if a range had tried to learn how to writhe. Its eyes were like the red of a wine that has stared too long at a brazier. On its back, fir trees grew as if it had been a ridge since the dawn of stones. Its belly ran with sores through which it drooled the poison of old metals. The river foamed at its bowls when it took breath. This was no tidy dragon. It was a memory of chaos come down in scales. Susanoo did not charge. He had learned in heaven that his temper makes mistakes when he rushes. He asked for a cask and then for another, until he had 8 great tubs made ready. He had the old man brew a rice wine so strong that its smell pulled at the roots of the tongue. He and the parents built a fence of stout posts, and in the fence they made 8 gates. Behind each gate they set 1 vat of the fierce drink. They sealed the fence as carefully as a priest seals a letter. Then the storm god stood back and rested his hand on the hilt of a sword that knew it was about to learn a better song. Even monsters have habits. As the appointed evening sank its chilly finger along the river, Orochi came down from the pass with a motion like the slow fall of a landslide. Each head tasted the air and found the sweet of the wine and pushed forward toward a gate. The fence held. The heads bent. They drank. The sake was a lake to them, and they plunged their throats until the tub stood empty, and their tongues hung from their mouths, and the tips of their tails twitched with the foolish joy of drunks. Their eyelids dragged closed. A mountain fell asleep. Susanoo moved then. He did not roar. He stepped through the fence with the calm of a man who has lit the last lamp in a temple and is checking the locks. He brought his blade down on a neck and then on another. Clean work without flourish, and the heads rolled away like hailstones that cannot melt. He waded forward through blood that ran black in the night and silver in the moon, and at each stroke the strength of the storm found a better use than anger. He hacked the body into sections so that it would never knit itself together and sigh and stand up again. The earth shuddered. The river boiled with the hot disorder that follows a justice well done. When he came to the great tail, he struck and felt a jar that told him metal had kissed metal. He frowned and cut again, and found within the tail a blade of such fineness that the god himself caught his breath. It was not a thing made by any forge he knew. It carried the memory of clouds that gather and of the clear mind that disperses them. They named it Ama no Murakumo no Tsurugi, the heavenly sword of gathering clouds. It would later be called Kusanagi, the grass cutter, for a deed to come, but that song belonged to another age. Susanoo lifted the sword and understood that sometimes a beast dies, not only to end a hunger, but to release a gift. He washed the blade and held it up to the night. Then, because even the proud know when they owe a sister a gesture of reparation, he sent the sword to Amaterasu in the high plain. "Take this," the message said. "Let it be a token that your brother has learned at least one way to do the work of order." In later centuries, people would say that this blade and a mirror and a jewel were the three objects by which a sovereign is known. In this first moment, it was simply a beautiful weapon rescued from a carcass and given upward with a bow. With the serpent destroyed, Susanoo returned to the house by the river and took the comb from his hair. Kushinada stood in the chamber like a vow kept. He married her with words that remembered that tenderness is also a strength, and they built a home at Suga in Izumo, where the air is as clear as water found at the base of a cedar. There, the storm god is said to have spoken the first poem in the language, a verse that compares the making of a house to the gentle encircling of a bride, a verse that comes to a resting place that is almost a sigh of release. Poetry and the sword often keep company in the biographies of gods and of men. Susanoo did not become a tame spirit. He remained changeable as light on a wave. Yet the valley learned that his path could be aligned with the safety of fields. He taught people how to cut channels that let floods run where floods should run. He reminded them to tie their roofs to their frames. He stood between sea rage and house fire and called each by its proper name. He had once torn up dikes in a fit of careless victory. Now he told boys to put their feet against the base of a wall and test it the way a sailor tests a rope with his hands and his ear. He had married into a lineage that kept shrines as well as hearths. Kushinada brought a reverence to the house that mellowed the corners of his temper. From time to time, he would go down to the shore and stand with a tide in his eyes, and then return, carrying fish whose scales looked like small coins of sunrise. The old couple lived out their years with a grandchild on each knee, and with the settled sense that the mountain pass above the river no longer contained a mouth that opened into their kitchen. In this chapter, it is worth lingering over the craft that saved the girl and the valley. The old texts insist on the number 8, as if the rhythm of that number itself were protective. 8 heads, 8 tails. 8 gates, 8 vats. The tale carries the taste of a charm spoken aloud. There are echoes here of the way communities build layered defenses. A gate can be broken. 8 gates share the load of danger. A monster can resist a cup of wine. 8 vats teach it to forget its hunger in a flood of sweetness. Susanoo did not fight nature with raw contest. He fed one appetite to lull another, and then brought the sword to a neck that no longer danced. The story honors cunning and preparation as much as it honors strength. There is also the matter of the hidden sword. Weapons inside monsters appear in many traditions, like hearts in boxes and names in eggs. Here, the discovery makes a double point. First, it declares that in the gut of chaos there can be a gift that belongs to order, a token forged in mystery that only a conqueror can free. Second, it shows a god at his best when he sends that gift on, instead of keeping it to strut before the village. The sword that will one day be drawn by a mortal hero belongs to the sun before it belongs to kings. Susanu's house at Suga became a place of instruction. Here, boys were told by elders who had seen the river run red that rage is a poor engineer. Here, girls were taught by a woman who had been a comb that a calm head is as valuable as a broad shoulder. The god who had frightened heaven learned to sleep with his face uncreased and to wake with his fingers loose. He did not stop being a storm. He learned to be a storm that understands the difference between a field and a fortress. Yet the history of Izumo does not end with a wedding and a poem and a buried tale. The land raises leaders among its kami just as it raises moss on stones. The house of Susanu would send forth a descendant who would tame the central plains and order mischief into law. That work lay in the hands of a god whose name means master of the great land, a patient maker of roads and cures and bargains. He would learn kindness from a hare and courage from a trickster and prudence from tests set by an ancestor who respected sharper minds. His age would answer a call from the high plane and would mark a new transfer of authority from earth to heaven. Before that tale begins, let us stand one last time at the fence of 8 gates and listen to the river sliding past the stumps of what once thought itself eternal. If you lean close, you can still smell sweetness in the mud and iron in the weeds. The air of Izumo carries the memory of a night when laughter fled from the world and then returned, and of a later night when something even darker came down the mountain and never walked back up again. It is for such nights that gods are allowed to be difficult, so that when the moment comes, the difficulty can be turned into rescue. From the high plain, the sun watched the river valley regain its ordinary peace and felt a nod rise within her that a brother was beginning to make better use of his noise. In the palace, a sword rested on a stand of silent wood. In a garden, a bride learned the paths of her new house. In the pass, a silence took seat, where a many-headed thing had once sagged. The story moves now from the storm to the land, and from the flash of a blade to the patience of rule. Islands endure by the patience of their makers. After the serpent was cut and the river of Izumo ran clean, the work of shaping the country passed into hands that favored craft over clamor. Susanoo had offered the valley a thunder lesson and a love song. What the land needed next was a steward who would make roads where there had been only tracks, who would coax medicine out of bitter greens, who would teach spirits and people how to share a household. That steward rose from the lineage of the storm. He is remembered by a name that is both title and fate, master of the great land, Kuninushi. He did not begin as the tallest tree in the grove. He was the youngest among a brood of brothers so numerous that storytellers give up counting and call them 80. They were proud hunters and striders who spoke of marriage as if it were a game played with spears. Their target was a princess of the Inaba region, a woman of sharp mind and eyes like clear river water. Her name was Yagami Hime. The 80 brothers set out to woo her with the swagger of men who assume that the door of a heart opens to noise. Kuninushi traveled behind them like a servant, burdened by their bundles, his shoulders wearing the marks of straps. There is a particular kind of greatness that walks at the end of a line and learns to see what leaders miss. On the way, they came upon a white hare in dreadful pain. Its skin had been stripped by a cruel trick of sea folk, and the creature shivered in a patch of sand that stung it with every breath. The elder brothers laughed at the animal and offered false counsel, which is a form of malice. They told the hare to bathe in salt surf and lie in the wind. The poor beast did as told, and its agony grew like fire under dry brush. Then the last man to pass set down his burdens and knelt. Kuninushi spoke as one speaks to children and to those who suffer. "Wash first in fresh water," he said. "Then lie upon a bed of soft reeds, and the pollen will be balm." The hare did this, and was restored by the simple kindness of water and plant dust. The creature stood whole again, and blessed the man who had seen it, prophesying that the princess of Inaba would not choose a suitor who mocked pain. She would choose the one who had stooped to help a hare. So it happened. Yagami Hime held a court of her own judgment. She saw through ornaments and boasts, and named the youngest as her husband. The 80 glowed with insult, and their glow was dangerous. Pride that has been cut bleeds rage. They tried to kill their brother with a scheme that would have suited ogres. They coaxed him into a burning trap and left him as charcoal for the wind. In one telling, it is his mother who found a way to call him back. In another, gods of healing stepped from groves and mountains and brought him around with herbs and breath. Whichever the path, the boy who had lifted a hare to mercy was lifted in turn by hands that cared for him. He rose with scars that would later read like scripture. The elder brothers tried again, and the world grew tired of their malice. The mother who had rescued the youngest urged him to flee to the far root of the earth, where Susanoo kept a house beneath thunder. "If you would live," she said, "go down and seek the Storm Father. Take his tests, win his favor. Gain a weapon that cannot be turned by envious kin." Kuninushi obeyed, because obedience to wise counsel is a form of courage that ballads do not always praise loudly enough. The path to the undercountry led through valleys where the wind smelled of iron, and through halls lit by a glow that seemed to rise from within the stones. There, in a fortress of strange hospitality, he met a daughter of Susanoo named Suseri Hime. She saw in him what he did not yet know he possessed, the steady flame that cooks food without charring it. Love found its sentence in their first look. Susanoo arrived with a laugh like surf under a cliff and stared at the visitor who wanted to marry his child. The old storm does not give consent to any hand without a trial. "If you seek to be kin," he said, "then live this night in the hall where serpents sleep. The snakes are unkind." The boy went to the hall, and Suzurihime slipped to him a scarf that held a protection charm. When the snakes raised their heads, he wrapped himself in the gift, and the bite could not find his skin. Other trials followed, each with the flavor of an object lesson. Survive a room of centipedes whose armor sings against itself. Escape a chamber filled with bees that smell fear with a nose for truth. Sleep in a storehouse made of the things that wake if you look at them wrong. In each case, the daughter supplied the wisdom that balances valiance. She taught him that a string can be a leash for trouble, that a tune can turn anger aside, that a grain of patience is a mountain in disguise. At last, Susanoo set the sharpest test. He asked the boy to draw his own hair into a knot and use a bow to pin it in place, then sent him out to an empty field and fired the grass around him. Flames drew a circle and began to tighten. Kuninushi did not thrash at the fire or plead with the sky. He remembered the old story that a blade can cut grass when it must. He cut a path where the circle was weakest and escaped the heat that tried to frame his last breath. There are many lessons here, and one of them is simple. A trap does not hold a mind that knows how to find a seam. Satisfied, or at least contained by respect, Susanoo yet tested the youth one last time. He hung the great sword that had once cut a serpent above the marriage bed, as if to remind all parties that a god keeps his edge, even in domestic bliss. The gesture was gruff blessing dressed as warning. He then gave his daughter to the survivor with a look that said, "Take care of what I love, and I may, on a good day, remember to approve." From the store of his power, he offered words that could bind and words that could loosen. The young couple left the halls beneath and rose again into the lands of light, carrying with them trophies less visible than blades. They had patience and a habit of listening, and the knowledge that a house survives when its keepers laugh before anger takes the floor. Once returned to the river world, Kuninushi set about his great work. In the old tongue, they call it the making of the land. The phrase means more than walls and fields. It means the art by which spirits and mortals learn to share a calendar. He became the one to whom local gods brought disputes. He learned the names of marshes and the tempers of winds. He taught healing that moved beyond the camp recipe and became a set of prayers and instructions. Night fever yields to water taken with a charm made from the seventh leaf of a stalk that grows where cranes sleep. The bite of a bad spirit yields to smoke that passes 3 times through a ring of reed and 3 times through a ring of willow. These details make historians frown and grandfathers smile. A people is stitched by such fragments. In this labor, he found a companion as odd as a legend can grant. The figure was oar-tall to the knee and boys small above it, sly of eye and quick of hand. He was called Sukuna Bikona, which is to say little lord, and he came ashore one day on a stalk that floated like a boat. Some say he slipped from the sleeve of a god who was cursing a gate. Others say he was born from a seed thrown away by a careless giant. However his coming, he greeted Kuninushi with the insolence of one who knows he will endear himself before the day is out. Together they swept aside sickness and taught the brewing of medicines that eased bone ache and soothed childbirth. They taught farmers the courtesy by which a field repays its keeper. They chased uncanny pests from granaries with rituals that look like jokes and are not. They set boundary stones that spirits could understand, and they taught the songs one sings when asking a hill to share a road. For a time, the pair was a comedy of mismatched size and perfect aim. Then, as odd friends do, the small one said farewell and leaped across the sea to dwell where distance forbids visits. Kuninushi watched the glitter path of his departure and returned to his rounds with the quiet that follows the end of a fine chapter. By now, the 80 brothers had spent their malice. Some had fallen to their own devising. Others had wandered off into obscurity, which is a better fate than they deserved. The master of the great land stood in a harvest plain and saw that the gods of the hills no longer came down to ruin the rose at night. Children played at imitating his stride, which is how a people decides what a hero looks like. The shrines that rose under his eye faced east and west, with a correctness that kept the weather polite. The first markets formed on the edges of festivals and grew into meetings where news found feet. It was not a golden age, for there is no such thing, but it was the sturdy time in which gold learns to be alloyed with patience. Order in one realm attracts the attention of another. In the high plain, the sun had returned to her duties and the court had rebuilt what the storm had broken. From that height, Amaterasu and her council looked down and saw a land ready for a next sentence. They had long held the charge that the line of the high plain would one day take stewardship of the reed plain below. The pact between the realms needed making. The decision was to ask for a gift and then to send proof that refusal would be unwise. Such is the way of many treaties. Before force, words. After words, the right messenger with the right hands. Envoys came and went, One called a sword flash in human form descended by the noses of gods and the gullies of mountains and stood before Kuninushi to present the request with courtesy sharpened by destiny. The master of the great land did not reach for his own blade. He called his sons. First came Koto Shironushi, a god of harbors and of fortune, who knows that a ship must consent to be lucky. He listened neither long nor with reluctance. He agreed. He took up his boat and his hook and withdrew to quiet places, and the sea made room for the keel as a host makes room for a guest whose good sense is known. The second son was Take Minakata, a power of the arm and the proud shoulder, a god whose faith comes written in sinew. He walked down from the north where mountains give men a straightforward temper. He looked upon the envoy, who was the thunder of law given limbs, and declared himself unwilling to yield any ground to heaven. When speeches fail, men and gods go to grips. They seized each other by the wrist. Takeminakata felt a hand that shifted under his palm and became first ice and then flame. And in that metamorphosis, he began to understand that he was not wrestling a mere courier. He strained and stamped and felt his own living strength matched and surpassed without malice. Then he was thrown and pinned with a pressure that did not injure but allowed no argument. He rose from the dust with red ears and a pulled pride and left the field, not skulking but not singing either. He went to the province of Shinano where rivers are young and promised to live by a vow that has a mountain's weight. Leave trouble to those who like it. Kuninushi watched his sons choose their roads and measured the offer of heaven against the health of the land he had taught to breathe well. He asked a thing both modest and magnificent. If I give the surface and the sunlight to the grandchild of the high plain, let me keep the realm that eyes do not see, the hidden part of the world, the space behind the hedge where secrets nap. Build for me a shrine that honors this office, a house of pillars so tall that cranes will mistake it for a cliff, and a roof so generous that rain will hush its own noise upon it. Let the people remember that the unseen hosts as much life as the seen. In return, I will give the open country to the new order and bless its plows. The bargain pleased both sides. The envoy nodded, and the earth answered with a tremor of agreement rather than fear. Craftsmen gathered with the eagerness that follows a commission worthy of song. They felled cedar and cypress with prayers that asked the trees to walk willingly. They shaped beams that remembered the mountain even as they learned to be roof. They raised a staircase like a soft ladder for gods. They laid white gravel that looks like starlight fallen and never cleared away. The shrine at Izumo rose and spread its eaves like a sheltering wing. In seasons of festival, many gods visit, and it seems that the air there has more rooms than the eye can count. For Kuninushi, the place became both palace and promise. In that precinct, he took his seat as patron of good marriages and builder of nations and keeper of the furtive realm, where a thought becomes a thing. When the shrine was consecrated, the master of the great land set aside the royal name that attaches to the surface of affairs. He did not die. He turned. He entered the courteous shadows and took charge of the world that lives behind the curtains. In song, he is called the Great Spirit of the Unseen Land. If you whisper at a crossroad and your whisper is not wasted, it is his office that makes the whisper worth the breath. If a plan works because you remembered to be kind at the start, someone may say he walked beside you that day and adjusted your elbow at the right moment. Thus the land passed from the stewardship of a patient maker to the care of a lineage that would one day send a prince out of the clouds. The transfer was not a sack thrown into a cart. It was a ceremony conducted by grown souls. Earth kept its household gods. Heaven set its seal. The story that begins with a spear stirring a sea, now prepared to welcome a foot from the sky. First would come a grandson who carries a mirror and a sword and a jewel. Then a hunter who will wed a blossom and decline a rock, and so teach every mortal that beauty often comes with brevity. After that, a boy who loses a hook, and in losing finds a dragon palace, and a princess, and a history. At last, that history will put on a crown and a capital and a calendar, but that is beyond the hill that we have just climbed. For the moment, imagine the great roof at Izumo shining after rain. A rope as thick as a river hangs across the entrance and swallows even stubborn impurity. Inside, pillars rise like quiet trees, and the air is patient. The master of the great land is there, not visible and not absent, the way a hearth is in a house, even when no flames are lit. In the fields beyond the shrine, the ditches follow the lines he taught, and in the market a woman sells concoctions that soothe a cough, because long ago a little lord and a tall friend compared leaves and found a compound that worked. The bargain holds. The hills offer foxfire and the courts offer law, and between them walk mortals who greet gates and stones and streams with small gestures of respect that cost nothing and save the world. There is a way a story tilts when heaven decides to step upon earth. It does not fall like a stone or drift like a leaf. It lowers itself with ceremony, as a great lantern is lowered into a hall that has been swept of every grain of dust. From the high plain, the sun goddess looked upon the reed plain below and saw a land ordered by patience and treaties, a country that had learned the speech of ditches and the courtesy of shrines. The time was right to join sky to soil with a living bridge, not a span of rope or cloud, but a person who would carry the weight of daylight in his bones. Her first thought had not been the grandson. In the old recounting, the sun goddess turned to her son, who is called the master of broad skies, and asked that he descend to rule. He looked upon the earth and hesitated, for he knew that the work of founding is a long meal with hard bread, and he wished to be sure that the table was set. Messengers tried the road instead, and one of them lost himself in the pleasures of the lower world, wooed by a bride and lulled by the soft lies of comfort, until an arrow returned to him the truth that such forgetfulness is fatal. The lesson was received. Heaven must send not a wanderer but a scion with a mandate bright enough to blind doubt. So the choice fell upon the sun goddess's grandson, a young god whose name is Ninigi. He was given a company of deities to guide and guard and advise, for even a divine prince profits by counsel and by roads walked by others. The path lay through the ledges of cloud to the mountains of the south, where cedar takes hold with confidence. They called this descent the coming of the heavenly grandchild, and it was the hinge by which the age of gods would swing toward the world of men. Before he left, his grandmother placed in his keeping 3 objects whose meaning is older than thrones. The first was a mirror wrought so perfectly that light rests upon it as water rests in a still bowl. The second was a string of curved jewels, the color of wine and pine, smooth and heavy with a patient glow. The third was a sword that had once slept inside a serpent and had been lifted from the wound by a god who finally learned the right use of his anger. These were not toys or trinkets. They were pledges. The mirror promised rule that reflects and considers. The jewel promised a bond between rulers and ruled that is both beautiful and binding. The sword promised the courage to cut away what endangers fields and families. Ninigi stood ready. In his company were deities whose names read like lines of an invocation. There was the goddess who dances dawn out of the cave and laughs fear away. There were the keepers of ritual who remember the correct rice to scatter and the right words to speak when inviting fortune to sit down. A powerful one of great hands waited to brace the way if mountain passes grew stubborn. Together they made a procession that would have filled the heart of any storyteller with the pleasure of pageantry. At the lip where sky becomes hill, they found the tall and formidable spirit who stands at the threshold of the lower world. He is the Lord of the Great Way, and his name carries the squint of a sailor peering into the Sunday. He refused at first to move aside, for threshold gods are not bribed by titles or dazzled by retinues. The company did not draw swords. The Dancer of Dawn stepped forward and, as she had done at the mouth of the cave, she translated necessity into delight. She brought laughter to the feet of the guardian and flattered his pride with praise that was both deft and truthful. He smiled, and his stubbornness unknotted. He led them down the right spur into the mountains of Kyushu and stood by, as Ninigi planted his foot upon a peak of clear air. The mountain is called Takachiho, and there the prince made camp. The air tasted of cedar and river, and the beginning of a story that would be told for centuries. He set in order the gifts of heaven that had come with him, and began the work of rule. Rule in old lands is not the bark of commands. It is the slow establishment of the proper relations between fields and floods, between shrines and markets, between old gods and new names. Ninigi brought a steadiness that pleased the hills. He did not chase the local spirits from their homes. He asked them to share a calendar. They consented because consent had been paid for with courtesy. Soon there came a day when the mountain god of that region sent 2 daughters to visit the new lord. The elder was Iwanaga, the Lady of the Rock, whose presence has the quiet of granite and the stubborn comfort of stone warmed by Sunday. The younger was Konohana, the Lady of Blossoms, whose step is the light rhythm of spring and whose smile carries more promise than a field of buds. The father did not simply offer them as one man offers horses. He sent both so that the ruler who took them would enjoy a double blessing. Through rock he would endure. Through blossom he would be lovely and abundant. Ninigi saw the younger first. He loved at once. He asked for her hand and did not ask for the elder. The message returned to the mountain lord, who fair-minded as he was felt the sting of insult. He sent back a warning wrapped in courtesy. You have chosen the flower and refused the rock. Because you denied the elder, your line will be beautiful and short-lived. If you had married the elder also, your line would have lasted as mountains last. Thus did a god write mortality into the calendar of kings and of ordinary people as well. The tale is harsh, and yet it holds the truth that we embrace brightness even knowing it fades. We are made by that choice as much as by our breath. Ninigi and Konohana were married with rites fit for a union meant to anchor a realm. The bride was not long in joy before rumor put a stain upon it. She conceived quickly, and her husband felt a small doubt rise in him like a fish testing the surface. He wondered if the child was of his own seed or of some secret lover's. Doubt in a ruler is an acid. It eats wood and then stone, and then the hand that holds both. Konohana answered the creeping poison with a trial that has been told and retold around hearths. She built a birth hut of reeds and entered it when the time came. She told him that if the child within her were not his, the flame would claim her. She set the hut alight and sat in the center, as if seated in the middle of a full moon. Fire eats greedily, and then with a kind of grace. The neighbors watched with faces drawn tight, and the husband stood with a mouth that had forgotten how to close. The smoke vented out through the thatch in ribbons. When the roof fell at last, it fell around her and not upon her. She walked out bearing a son whose skin glowed with the health of blessings. He was followed by another son, and in some songs by a third. The names of the boys differ in the mouths of different provinces, but their offices are clear. One loved the sea and the luck of hooks. One loved contest. One loved the mountain and the chase. The eldest was a master of the shore, and the second found his fate later in lines that do not hold us here. The youngest had a name that remembers slopes and antlers. He is the prince of the mountain hunt, and he is the one whose story will carry us into oceans and palaces and meetings with kings who wear scales. Before we go with him, we must see the shape of the home he left. Ninigi governed from the south with the calm that had been given to him with the mirror. He learned which harvest prayers belong before planting and which belong before threshing. He settled disputes with a patience that taught people to bring him their quarrels before they took them to their fists. He kept the guidance of the threshold god close and the laughter of the dawn dancer closer, for there is no court that does not sour when those two go missing. He was not a maker like the master of the great land, who measured roads and marked boundaries for spirits. He was a settler of high order. The difference matters. Builders bring together. Rulers keep together. The archipelago needed both. The new family grew, and through the children the gifts of heaven began to wind themselves into human lines. Konohana walked her gardens and watched with a new tenderness the fall of petals. She had been denied the sister whose name is endurance. She did not brood upon it. She taught her sons that the brevity of blossoms makes them sharper. A field of rice in perfect ripeness is a note held just long enough and then dismissed. A marriage is not the same joy at its last hour as at its first, and this is not failure. It is the music of being alive. The youngest son, who loved the mountains, came to quarrel with his elder brother, who loved tides and shoals. It began with a request that seems simple. "Let us exchange tools for a time," said the hunter, "so that I may know the taste of your business and you may learn mine." The fisherman agreed and lent his hook while he took up the bow. The experiment went badly. The hunter lost the hook. He looked for it with the zeal of a new priest in a full library and could not find it. He made many hooks and offered them to the elder in apology. The fisherman would not accept. He wanted the very hook that had been given. The story turned in that moment toward a palace far from shore and a princess whose father wears the sea like a robe. But we will not rush ahead. Ninigi looked upon his sons and weighed their quarrel and kept the peace with the steady hand that closes quarrels without reopening them the next day. He sent the younger toward the coast with advice that sounded like common sense and proved to be the opening of another chapter. "Find where that which is lost goes to rest," he said. "Some things do not lie on the sand. They lie in the vaults of kings who live under waves. If you are brave and polite, the sea will discover that it is your ally." There is another episode that belongs to the house of Ninigi and bears upon all who come after. In later years, men and women looked back and said that the choice of blossom over rock fixed the span of a human life. Mortals would shed their petals. They would be beautiful and brief. This was not a curse alone. It was also a gift that made meaning possible. Eternal days pile up like stones and smother the heart. Measured days teach the heart to choose. Rulers learned from this that a crown is not a ladder to immortality. It is a circle of responsibility that must be given away at the proper time, and the giving is of the essence of its honor. The court around Ninigi began to take on the shape that future courts would imitate. There were keepers of purifications who knew the names of the small gods who lift stains from thresholds and hands. There were singers who could soothe a crowd after a verdict and so prevent knives from being drawn. There were watchers of the moon who counted nights with precision and told the farmers when to begin their plantings with a confidence that calmed the most anxious. There were smiths whose forges produced tools before weapons, and whose hammers were taught to rest on festival days. Rule is a choreography. Ninigi learned the steps and taught them. Now the tale begins to gather itself for a voyage. The youngest son will go in search of a lost hook, and we shall go with him. He will pass down into the halls of the sea, where pillars are shaped like the ribs of whales, and lanterns are fishes that have agreed to stand still and shine. He will find a princess whose beauty is made of water, and the movement of water, and the silence after water. He will break a promise and pay for it with a grief that does not only belong to him. He will return with a tide jewel that can flood a plain, and with a peace that will allow his children to be born into a world where both mountain and shore know their limits. Before he leaves, one more look at the mountain and the prince who planted his foot there. The heavenly grandson did not conquer the land with spears. He married it. He asked it to have patience with his house, and he promised patience in return. The goddess of the sun had sent him with a mirror, a jewel, and a sword. He used the first two every day, and the last only when necessity required it. A kingdom grown by reflection and promise and restrained force is a kingdom that can raise a boy to manhood without teaching him to love cruelty. In quiet hours, the dancers of dawn would rehearse in the courtyards, and their feet would whisper the story of the cave and the mirror and the laughter that calls light back from self-exile. Children in the hills learned the names of the treasures and traced them in the air with their fingers and pretended to be rulers who required no scolding to do justice. Song gathered around these scenes until a people could hum its own founding. In the evenings, the prince would sit with his bride and listen to the soft crash of far surf and the closer script of crickets. He envied nothing. He awaited only the next right task. The next right task belongs to the son who lost a hook. He is a hunter who will learn the courtesy of the ocean and will discover that the heart of a dragon king is not that different from the heart of a mountain god who loves his daughters. He will hold a tide in his hand and then remember to let it go. From his line, a child will later rise who will turn a journey east into the first chapter of human sovereigns. That is a hill we will climb when we reach it. For now, the lantern of heaven burns over Takachiho. The mirror glows on its stand. The jewel waits in its silk. The sword sleeps like a promise made to future danger. A prince sits with clean hands. A blossom rests in his shadow and smiles, knowing what she has given up and what she has made possible. The youngest son lifts his face to the night and smells salt on the wind. Rivalry begins as a small crease in a shared cloth. In the house of Ninigi, it took the shape of two brothers whose talents pulled in different directions. The elder loved the sea and knew its pulses the way a harpist knows strings. He is called Hoderi in the old diction, which is to say the one whose catch mounts high upon the shore. The younger loved the mountains and the quiet of stalked paths. He is called Huri, the prince who listens to leaf and antler and learns patience from the slope of a hillside. Between them lay an affection that could have been a bond, and a pride that could be a flint. The quarrel did not begin with insult. It began with curiosity. "Let us trade for a time," said the younger. "Give me your hook and take my bow. I will learn the sea, and you the hunt." The elder consented, for brothers before wisdom comes often think a trade will do no harm. Huri took the hook and went down to the edge of the water and made his line ready. He cast as one casts a question and waited as one waits for an oracle. The line drew tight, then slackened, and in the slow theater of trial and error the hook disappeared. Perhaps it caught in a rock. Perhaps a great fish carried it in a sudden rush. Perhaps the sea decided that the tool of a fisherman should not ride the thumb of a hunter. Huri searched the strand. He searched the shallows. He made many hooks and offered them with bowed head. Hoderi refused to be pacified. Only the lost hook would do, the very iron shaped by the hand that had shaped it first. That answer, stubborn and simple, sent a young man under waves and into halls where daylight is a guest. Huri went to his father and asked counsel. Ninigi did not scold. He is the kind of ruler who knows that blame does not grow hooks from water. Find where lost things are kept, he said. There are palaces beneath the floor of the sea, and they have chiefs and courtiers and treasure rooms. Do not go as a thief. Go as a supplicant with good manners and a clear voice. The prince bowed and took the advice and walked the shore until he found a place where the world seems to end in a thought. There he sat as the tide climbed and spoke to it as if to a lord. The tide took him as a litter takes a guest and bore him down along watery avenues roofed with blue. The palace of the Sea King is not built with timber and tile. It is made of the order of currents and the patience of coral. Pillars rise like the bones of ancient whales, and the floor is strewn with sand so fine that it keeps the softest footfall secret. Lanternfish hang like patient stars where a corridor needs light. The gates are guarded by fish with stern mouths and eyes that roll like old generals remembering battles. There are gardens of kelp that turn in slow dances and courtyards paved with shell. The lord of this city is called Watatsumi or Ryujin, and his beard moves like a wave that has decided to sit and listen. Huri arrived at a gate and was recognized not by face but by the rightness of his approach. He stood with his hands open and his head slightly bowed and asked to be heard. The gatekeeper, who had seen many who demand and fewer who ask, led him within. There is a rule in all courts that a prince who knows how to wait is seated before men who shout their names. Huri was brought to a pavilion where a woman sat with the calm of water held by a bowl. She was the daughter of the Sea King, and her name was Toyotama, which means abundant jewels. The phrase suits her. She was the shimmer one sees when moon presses its cool fingers upon a surface. She lifted her eyes and the room forgot to breathe. Stories agree that love came upon them as love sometimes does, with the precision of a hawk. It is not a dart that wounds by surprise. It is a swift alignment in which two shapes suddenly fit, and the world makes a small, approving sound. The Sea King looked upon the visitor, and in a dozen heartbeats read the marks of lineage and courtesy that sit like seals upon a brow. He welcomed the prince and asked his business. Huri told the truth without embroidery. "I have lost my brother's hook," he said. "I seek it because the peace of my house requires the very hook that was given." Ryujin nodded. He sent for his fish. They came in a shoal that moved like a curtain drawn across a stage. He asked each one if a hook had troubled its throat. A red bream twisted and gaped. The servants fetched the hook from the gills and brought it upon a shell that glittered with the satisfaction of a task neatly done. There followed a season that the tales are content to describe as joy. Huri remained in the palace as a favored guest, and the Sea King became a father. Toyotama became a wife. Their wedding is sung with imagery that belongs to the floor of the ocean and to the lights that live there. Pearls were not merely decorations, but stars permitted to attend at a lower height. Crabs moved like scribes and wrote auspicious words in sand that cannot forget. The sea breathed in long content cycles, and the palace breathed with it. There are myths that stay in youth forever. This one is allowed to be mature and happy for a time, and that is a rare gift. Yet home is a gravity that does not sleep. After 3 years, Huri felt a pull toward the mountains that had taught him to move lightly, and toward the house where his father's counsel had set him upon this path. He went to his wife and asked leave to return to the upper world, promising a swift message and a swift return. Toyotama listened as women who have loved princes listen. She did not bind his promise with chains. She asked that he remember what was owed to the sea. Her father pressed 2 treasures into his hands to make a hard meeting softer. They are called the tide, controlling jewels. One brings water, and one draws it away. With one, a plane can be drowned, and with the other it can be reclaimed. The Sea King is not in the habit of gifting weapons without reason. He knew that Huri's quarrel would be waiting like an unemptied cup. He sent the jewels as a piece that could be forced if gentleness fails. The prince rose from the water to the coast of a familiar land and sought his elder brother. Hodori was no less stiff than before, and perhaps a degree more proud, for resentment does not sleep in absence. Huri returned the lost hook. He did not scold. He did not lecture about forgiveness. He asked for peace and was refused. The elder fished with rage for bait and cast a net of threats. Then Huri used the first jewel. He lifted it in his palm and spoke the word that a father-in-law had taught him. The sea climbed the shore and then the street and then the steps, until Hoderi found water at his belt, and then at his chest, and then at his lips. He called for mercy, which is a word that grows heavy upon a proud tongue. Huri raised the second jewel, and the water withdrew as if a bed had been made and needed smoothing. Hoderi fell to the ground like a fish dropped from a basket. He promised obedience, and this time he kept the promise. The quarrel ended in the only way some quarrels can end. Not in love, not yet, but in a recognition that there is a limit and that a boundary can be a blessing. Now the sea, which had been only stage and palace, returned as womb, for Toyotama followed her husband to the shore to give birth to their child on land. The old storytellers linger here with a tenderness that belongs to this figure more than to many others. She is not only a princess with jewels in her name, she is a woman who must keep 2 natures in balance. She asked Huri to build a birthing hut on the sand and to thatch it with the reeds of the beach. She asked him for privacy, and she asked it without pleading. "Do not look upon me during the birth," she said. The taboo is not an ornament in such a tale. It is the very plank upon which the next step must be taken. Huri promised, and for a time the promise held. The working of the world is sometimes framed by curiosity as by a narrow door. The moment came when the prince forgot his promise. Perhaps he heard a cry, and fear pried open his resolve. Perhaps pride wished to see the proof of his seed. Whatever the cause, he peered into the hut. He saw not a woman bent by pain, but the true form of a sea being giving life on the land. The texts call that form Nami, or Wani, a word that can point to a dragon, or a great reptile, or the sacred shape of a creature made from water's strength. The sight shocked him as a lightning shock can hurt even if it does not kill. He recoiled. He had looked where he was asked not to look. He had seen what should remain veiled, and by that sight had broken the spell that permits love to live across borders. Toyotama felt the breach as a coldness. She did not rage. She did not plead. She wrapped the newborn in soft cloth and kissed it with the sadness of a mother who must leave a cradle. She left the hut and walked into the tide and did not turn. She returned to the palace where lanternfish hang in careful patterns and put away her hurt, as women sometimes must, not because it is small, but because it is large and must be kept in a room where only the heart can bear to visit it. The child was left to the care of a woman whose name carries the sense of jewel and binding thread. She is Tamayori, the younger sister, and she became nurse and later wife to the one she raised. Such loops are not quite uncommon in the old recitations, for they speak to the way houses fold in upon themselves to keep a line alive. The boy received a name that sounds like a long breath. Ugaya Fukiezu is a mouthful that means the cormorant feather thatching was never completed, a phrase that remembers the hut begun and left unfinished because a promise broke and sent the mother back to her sea. He grew with the calm that sometimes sits on children who have been carefully watched. Tamayori taught him the proper bow at thresholds and the patience to listen to old men who tell the same story with a different ending. He married her when the years had turned and the proprieties could be arranged without scandal, and from their union came sons whose names write new pages. One of them will become a thread that runs from vision to capital and from capital to calendar. But that belongs to the next chapter. The melodrama of the broken promise deserves a moment more. It is not a scene placed to humiliate a hero or to blacken a bride. It is the engine by which a culture explains why border crossing demands reverence. A sea wife can love a land husband, and a land husband can love a sea wife, but there are conditions that protect both. A hut must be given to secrecy. A vow must not be taken as a toy. When vows are kept, worlds remain bridged. When they are broken, the worlds return to their own tides, and the child of their meeting must reconcile the loss by living well. Ugly later uses of this tale by crude minds do not erase its first intention. It asks listeners to respect what is asked in intimacy. It also asks them to accept that there are truths one should not demand to see. Hoderi did not vanish after his surrender. He becomes in the telling a figure of dignified retirement. He accepted smaller waters and let fortunes rest in younger hands. The tide jewels did not become toys of tyranny. They remained with Huri as reminders that the Sea King had made himself kin, and they were used sparingly, for good tools know when to stay in their box. Peace between mountain and shore is a peace made every day by men who choose not to dominate with the gifts that chance or fathers have given them. Huri himself did not take a throne from which to look down on fields. He is remembered as an ancestor more than as a lord. There is a pleasure in that, for ancestors feed longer than lords. He taught his sons where the stream bites at the bank, and how to pacify it with stones laid in a line that pleases a water god. He taught them to carry offerings that match the temper of a shrine rather than to throw splendor where quiet would be better. He kept near the coast where he could smell his mistake and so keep honest, and where he could tell stories about a palace whose lanterns are living fish without being laughed at. The sea princess did not forget him. The songs say that on certain nights, she rose upon the beach as a dragon that remembers being a woman and watched from a distance the child playing in the sand. The little boy looked up and smiled at a shape that frightened other children and then returned to his game, which is sometimes how a wound is healed. The mother returned to her rooms of coral and listened to reports from sand crabs, who gossip as well as any court lady. She lived as queens who have been hurt live, in dignity and in a quiet that makes a wide room feel as if a baby were asleep behind a screen. Tamayori kept the household. She is not a grand figure in the older poems, and yet without her there is no line. She fed what needed feeding. She trained what needed training. She carried to the child the blessings that come from a sea that respects the one who did not respect it, which is a kind of grace stronger than resentment. In time she married him and bore sons. Some tellings give 4 names. The one that matters to the great sweep of the narrative is the boy who will beget a leader. From that leader will come the man who sets an eastward course and calls a capital out of rivers and marsh, and sets a seat for his descendants upon a plain named for vines. But that is the work of the next chapter. The sea palace remains sunk in the blue, and its king remains attentive to the news delivered by mullet and eel. The tide jewels remain like thoughts in a drawer that no one opens unless necessity comes in clean shoes and explains itself. The brothers who began this tale have learned their measure. The father who gave counsel is satisfied to see a quarrel closed without blood. The blossom who chose a mortal's span watches her grandchildren and remembers that brevity can be kind. The boy whose name is a thatching left unfinished sleeps well in a house where both sea and land are present in the air, one as salt and one as loam. Take a last look at the hut on the shore. The reeds are dry now, and their shadows have the delicate look of ink brushed by a careful hand. There is a place in the thatch where the pattern is broken. The wind speaks there with a different voice, and when it does, if you have the habit of stories, you may hear a mother say to a child that he must live well since she cannot live with him. He does live well. He becomes a father. He becomes an ancestor. Through him, a nation will make a memory that pretends to be a history, and a history that remembers it was once a myth. The sea understands. The land understands. They taught him. The child left on the shore rose as children do when careful hands steady them. Ugaya Fukiayazu learned the ways of both sea and land and made a house where courtesy stood watch at the door. He grew into a man with the calm of a low tide and the steadiness of a mountain path. He married Tamayori, the aunt who had nursed him, and from their union came 4 sons, whose names would turn a hinge in the story of the islands. The eldest was Itsus, strong in arm and proud of shoulder. Then came Inahi, who felt the pull of waves in his dreams, and later followed that pull into the halls of the Sea King. The third was Mikeri, who loved the hunt and the rugged corners of the land. The youngest was Kamu Yamato Iwarabiko, whose name would be remembered as Jimmu, the one who would carry a promise east and set it down as a capital. The realm of Nenigi had ripened. Fields lay like open pages. Shrines wrote light upon air each morning. Law moved quietly among the people the way water moves under rice roots. Yet there was a sense in the air that the work needed a name and a seat, that a line that began with a mirror and a jewel must stand up from myth and sit down upon a plain. Iwarabiko was not the loudest of the brothers. He was the one who listened to advice and to omens and to the older gods who whisper in leaf and river. He looked to the east where the land of Yamato holds valleys that welcome rule and mountains that shelter plans. There, he was told, lies the heart that will beat for many centuries if approached with patience. The brothers gathered men who believed more in roads than in raids, and built boats that trusted the strength of their ribs. They set out from the southern islands with their stores and household gods, and the sea acknowledged them with a long, slow lift. They made landfall at the port of Naniwa, where river and sea forget their quarrel and marry. There they met a chieftain named Nagasunehiko, proud in the authority that local success gives and quick to resent the claims of strangers whose titles arrive with the wind. Words were exchanged that cut deeper than blades. Skirmish followed. An arrow found Itsus's ribs and cut short a life that had begun with such promise. The brothers grieved and withdrew, for Iwarabiko understood that a battle lost is sometimes a road offered by a god. They turned south and circled to the coast of Kumano, where the mountains lean toward the sea, and the forests speak the language of shrines older than courts. There, a thick sleep fell upon the company, a hazard that in such tales is never merely fatigue. It was a heaviness given by a god who wished to test their purpose. In the dreams of Takakuraji, a humble keeper of storehouses, a deity of thunder and straight justice, take Mikazuchi, placed a sword and a command. Put this blade into the hands of the leader who sleeps in your veil, and the sleep will break, and his road will open. The man woke with a start, and found the sword not only in his mind, but also in his storehouse, as if a thought had learned how to be iron. He carried the weapon to Iwarabiko, who took it with the respect a man shows a god who brings both victory and restraint. The sleep fell away from the company like a garment that had never fit. From Kumano they pressed inland. On a day when mist rose from the river in white sleeves, they met a guide whose sign is known across centuries. The bird had 3 legs and the authority of an envoy. It is called Yatagarasu, and it belongs to the company of omens that even the skeptical sheepishly honor. The bird did not caw commands. It flew ahead and perched, and flew ahead again, drawing the company up ravines and across ridges onto the inner plain of Yamato. The men walked with the ease of those who feel a hand upon their shoulders, and the land received them as a house receives a rightful heir returned from a journey. In time, the bird lifted into a last curve and was lost against a sun that was both witness and sponsor. The path lay open. Nagasunihiko remained a thorn. He had claimed the plain in the name of his habits and did not yield. Another fight was joined. The sword that had come from a dream showed what it had promised. Iwarabiko did not boast. He drove the enemy from the field, and in the wake of that victory made offerings to the gods of the hills and of the rivers he had crossed. For victories are not only about enemies, they are also about permission granted by the land itself. He raised a seat at Kashihara, where the earth holds level, as if it had been taught by a mason. There, tradition declares, he became the first emperor, a man with a throne that explains itself by pointing to a goddess of light in the family and to a long corridor of divine benefactors. So the age of gods placed a hand on the shoulder of the age of men and guided it into its first steps. From that day, the narrative leaves the halls of the sea and the forges of heaven less often. It walks more often in markets and camps and wheatlands. It follows rulers who claim the sun for a grandmother and yet must deal with the stubbornness of taxes and roads. The line that began with a grandchild born of sea and shore moved forward through reigns that in the old chronologies are long enough to satisfy nostalgia. Priests set the mirror and the jewel and the sword in their houses of honor, and taught that good rule reflects, binds, and defends. Children learned the names of the treasures and drew them in the dust. The kings listened to reminders set in cedar and rope that thresholds matter. Out of this young line rose a hero whose name blows through ballads like a gust along a pond. He is called Yamato Takeru, the brave of Yamato, a prince with a gift for disguise and for last chances. He is remembered not as a lawgiver, but as a breaker of stubborn necks, when the necks belonged to those who hurt the realm. He was the son of a later sovereign named Kiko, and his youth was a lesson in the danger of strength without calm. He is said to have slain a rough cousin by trick, which is an act that no priest would bless. Yet his road was not toward a throne, but toward the margins where order fails. There his qualities, both hard and bright, would find a stage. The first tale that clings to his name belongs to the south. In the country of Kumaso lived 2 chieftains whose ferocity had become a proverb. They taxed without mercy, they took what was not offered, and they mistook fear for tribute. The court sent the prince to pluck this thorn. He did not march at once with banners. He dressed as a maiden and entered the house where the brothers feasted. The eye is easily misled when pride has made it lazy. He sat among the dancers and the servers. When the hour was late and the drink was fat in the veins of the hosts, He stepped close to the elder and pulled from under his robe a sword that had memorized dark work. He cut the man where strength has no time to rise, and then struck down the younger. The elder, dying on the mat he had thought would hold him many more nights, spoke with a hurt clarity. "You are the real brave of Yamato. Take the name and leave this house to silence." The prince accepted the words, as a man might accept a heavy cloak, and wore it not without cost. There followed the long campaign eastward, where the woods are deep and the rivers go their own way. Rebellion had nested where roads were few and shrines were far apart. Yamato Takeru went like a sharpened intention. Before he set out, he visited his aunt, Yamato Hime, the priestess who kept the Shrine of the Sun at Ise. She received him not as a doting elder, but as a keeper of duties. She placed in his hands the sword that had once lived inside a serpent, and later been a token of reconciliation between a storm and a Sunday. Along with the sword, she gave a little pouch of magic that held the secret of fire, a tinder that would heed the voice of a man in danger. He took both with a bow that acknowledged the gravity of being entrusted with myths that had become metal. On the eastern plain, treachery tried to answer destiny. A local lord invited the prince to a hunt in high grass. Men moved outward through the reeds, and then the fields sighed as fire woke in lines laid by traitor hands. Flames rose in a ring that tightened with the glad malice of a net. The prince stood planted. He drew the serpent blade and swept it through the grass at his feet. The cut opened a passage. He brought out the pouch from Ise and kindled his own line of flame and whispered to the wind god to carry it outward. The wind obeyed the better plan. The counterfire leapt and met the first blaze and wrestled it down into a red confusion that could not choose a direction. The prince passed through smoke and outran the last tongues that wished for his boots. He turned upon the one who had invited him and settled an account that no court would later reopen. There were other contests. He took ships along jagged coasts and taught river forts to stand down. He fought a boar that was more spirit than animal and left its tusks planted in a tree as a lesson to hunters who brag. He faced a god of Mount Ibuki whose breath was cold enough to stop heartbeats. He thought to cut down the mountain itself and mocked the deity with an arrogant charge. The mountain god sent a storm of ice and vapor that beat him to the ground and left him staggering for days with a sickness that no medicine could sweeten. After that moment, he carried a fragility like a crack in fine glaze. Heroes are not granted invulnerability. They are granted time for one more task. He visited the shrine where the serpent sword would one day be honored rather than used, a house called Atsuta, where the air seems to know how to compose itself. He sent the blade back to dwell there, for even a prince can grow weary of the weight of a story. He crossed ranges and sat by the mouths of rivers and remembered a wife he had married in the east whose patience could halt a quarrel between warriors. He began the journey home, not trailed by drums, but by the soft recognition that a lone figure deserved. Sickness followed. On the plain near Ise, his strength faltered like a banner in wind that loses interest. He spoke to friends of a white bird he had seen in dreams. He laid down in grass that knew the exact length of his life. When he died, the air took on a clarity that often attends the last breaths of those who have used their days in the service of a wide house. His companions built a tomb that looked like a small hill and placed haniwa upon it, the clay sentinels that face away to watch for insult. Then, as the tales tell it, a white bird rose from the mound and flew across the marshes and the inlets, looking for a place where grief meets sky. They followed it to a final resting that felt proper. In that way, the man named Brave in a dying enemy's mouth left a sign that even sorrow could admire. In these stories, you can hear a culture deciding what it wants courage to be. It is skill, and not only muscle. It is the wit to put on a robe and enter a house as a woman when war would slam the door. It is the restraint to give a sword to a shrine and walk with lighter hands. It is the knowledge that a flame set in the right place can save a life, and a flame set in the wrong place can end a village. It is also the acceptance that even the sharpest edge cannot cut the law that all living things obey. The prince who did not fear the boar or the traitor or the steeper ridge could not overcome the cold of a mountain god he mocked. His death gave the country a new kind of memory. Not a list of victories, though there were many, but a pattern by which to measure the use of force and the limits of men. From the seat at Kashihara, the line that claimed the sun as ancestors continued. Priests kept the mirror bright and the jewels safe, and reminded young rulers that the sword draws last. Each spring, the fields looked up and asked whether they could trust the hands that turned them. The answer, more often than not, was yes, because the hands remembered a grandson who came down a mountain with a blade given by a storm god, and a young man who sailed under a three-legged bird, and a prince who once opened a wall of fire with a word, and later let a spirit bird carry his last name over wetlands. These are large signs. They taught small lessons. Bow at thresholds. Keep promises made at sea. Welcome laughter to councils. Ask a mountain before you step upon its pride. The age of gods had taught the rhythm of creation and loss and return. The age of emperors added the chording of law and the patience of records. Together they made a story that is told in shrines where ropes hang like thick rivers, and in tombs where clay figures face away into the fields, and in plays where a dancer stamps a tub and wakes the Sunday. A people does not live by bread alone. It lives by the sentences it repeats to itself when storms wake and when seasons turn. These chapters are such sentences.